Right. So most of us know that Tesco is going through some difficulty at the moment. It's the biggest supermarket in the UK. It has over 30% share of the market, yet its market share is dropping. There have been some changes in the management at the top. And some of you may be aware of the announcement that was made on the weekend, in the weekend's Financial Times, that in fact they're going to take a very much more localist approach to providing services, and the shops are going to be required to do that. So they're actually going to disband quite a large part of the headquarters and reduce the size of the procurement organisation, of the central procurement organisation. And this, we've done it. And this is the announcement that much of procurement is actually going to be devolved to local stores. Local managers should have a much better understanding of local demand. Each store will be able to choose its own products and ranges, but retain its core ranges. That should give a more responsive customer service, more responsive to customer needs. Should release initiative and creativity, greater use of local suppliers, and each store should be able to negotiate the best prices and best deals. Having a national approach, they argue, is not going to be as successful as operating locally. There'll be a greater variation in store designs as well, so that the designs can fit in much more with what local communities are looking for. And each store won't exactly have its own procurement and IT system. There will still be the main procurement and IT system across Tesco, but nevertheless, each store will be able to introduce variations. But centralised procurement of Tesco's own brand products will remain. Right, I see looks of incredulity on people's faces, which is what I'd hoped, because I made some similar comments at a conference last year, and people took it absolutely seriously. And I thought, what we need to do, we often have arguments, should we move from devolved to centralised procurement, what will be the benefits? So I thought, supposing we go the other way around, what might happen? So I've tried to look ahead as to what might happen to Tesco's. And I was shocked in January last year because the audience took it absolutely seriously, and I suddenly realised, oh dear. January 2014. An internal review indicates purchase price differentials of over 40% on some products. And that's what actually has been found in the UK public sector. There's some very big price differentials. Tesco blames suppliers for 25% of products out of stock at some stores. Always convenient to blame the suppliers. I've come across many procurement people who always blame the suppliers. It's not their fault. Yes, obviously seems a bit familiar. Many Tesco stores reduce product ranges by over 50% because the local people, procurement people, cannot handle the big range of products. So the thing to do is to reduce the product ranges. And suppliers claim Tesco's procurement is now chaotic. The number of contracts has increased 1,000-fold due to them having so many stores and each store letting their own contracts, and the suppliers are having to pass on the costs to Tesco. And the suppliers claim effective scheduling of deliveries now no longer takes place. So we've got huge queues of vehicles outside Tesco stores causing disruption. But that's not all. A Which survey indicates that Tesco's product quality is all over the place because we can't have every store assessing product quality. And Action Sustainability claims that Tesco's policies on sustainability and working conditions of overseas suppliers, and by the way, Tesco does have a policy on working conditions of overseas suppliers, and how many of working conditions of people working for overseas suppliers, and how many people here work for an organisation that has such a policy? No. So they argue that those policies have become meaningless because the local stores can't implement them. And the local suppliers claim they're actually getting less business from Tesco than before. And Tesco admits it doesn't have the data to refute such a claim. And that's certainly a problem in the UK public sector, that there's a lack of data on a whole range of government policies. And managers claim too many staff have had to be diverted from customer services to back office functions as well. A common criticism not only of the UK public sector but of private sector organisations. And that's not all. Tesco sued for 13 outbreaks of food poisoning due to lack of quality control. The procurement people, local procurement people, don't understand the specifications and so on. And a new store collapses, 10 deaths. But fortunately, it's not the fault of the local Tesco's people. It's the fault of the architects and cowboy builders. So that's okay. Tesco's own sales down by 27%, and a combination of fewer customers who each spend less, not surprising with the product range reduced. But the chief executive denies Tesco is in meltdown. We're going through major change and teething troubles are inevitable and will be overcome. We've all heard that before, whether it's private sector or public sector. Move on a bit though, and things do move on. Tesco's share price down by 90%. 25% of stores earmarked for closure. The Tesco chief executive resigns to spend more time with his family. And the director of procurement is replaced by an interim, and a takeover bid from the cooperative society is denied. And PwC are brought in to do a fundamental review. And they solve the problem because Tesco's taken over by the Co-op Monopolies and Mergers Commission clears it. And I use this as an example because also historically, let's think where the Co-op was. Some of you will be able to think where it was about 40, 50 years ago. It was the leading, if you can call it a supermarket, in the country. And it didn't get its supply chain together. It didn't get its procurement together. Yes, it operated regionally, but it really didn't get its procurement together. It ended up spending a lot more than other supermarkets on the procurement of common products, and we've seen what happened to the Co-op. It's also relevant to private sector organisations as well. PwC produced a report published, I think, in February this year, when they actually looked at large companies and looked at the procurement function in large companies. And for a very high proportion of major companies, including global companies, procurement is responsible for less than 40% of that company's procurement spend. And very often there's very little expertise applied to the remaining 60%. And where you're operating on pretty small profit margins, then that makes a big difference to the competitiveness of companies. I could comment further that IBM used to have fairly devolved procurement, and I visited one of their sites. I know it's going back a while, 40 years ago, and they had a small procurement organisation on one site, and what they were doing was they had a lot of information. I was really impressed, actually, because they showed year-on-year savings of 2-3%. Unfortunately, the procurement organisation wasn't big enough to find out what was happening in the rest of the market, and other rivals had got prices down by 40%. So they thought they were doing quite well. They were benchmarking themselves internally, but they weren't actually benchmarking themselves with what was happening elsewhere. So I thought what we'll do is hold a mirror to public sector procurement, but the same principles apply to private sector organisations. So these are really general. So what does it look like? How well is it being managed? Can it be done better? And are the prerequisites there for real innovation as well? Well, there's about £230 billion of spend the UK public sector has. Quite frankly, no one knows what it is. We keep on getting figures to the nearest billion. Now, billion is a huge amount, and the latest figure I've seen is 238 billion. I can't track when a good proportion of that is, quite frankly. So first point is it's 230 billion, but no one knows. But that doesn't matter, does it? It's only £3,500 per adult and child living in this country. So if we don't know where that money is going or who's spending it, we needn't worry too much, perhaps. It's only our money, after all. How many of you have got children? Yeah, anyone with more than 2? Yeah, anyone with 3? 4? Yeah, 5? No, 4 children. Family of 6, £20,000. That's what you're spending towards, that's what you're contributing towards public sector procurement. Salutary less each year. 1/6 of UK gross domestic product, about 0.75% of global GDP, and its size makes it critical to the delivery of public services. But nevertheless, I think we'd all agree that there needs to be effective management of this. And it's also critical as well to delivering innovation, sustainability and economic growth policies, because it's the biggest resource the government has to do that. When you look at what it's putting into innovation and so on in terms of grants and in terms of also regional aid to support regional suppliers, it's at the most £2 or £3 billion. I don't think it's even that a year. Yeah, public sector procurement is £230 billion. So if the government really wants to make a difference to innovation in the UK and to start to create economic growth, it really has to start to use the biggest resource it's got, which is procurement spend. Anything else it does is absolutely peanuts compared to the procurement resource. So public sector procurement, I told you I couldn't figure out where the £230 billion have come from. I've made some sort of estimate based on some of my knowledge. Central civil government, 55 billion. Francis Moore the other week said 50 billion, and he didn't make it clear whether that included Ministry of Defence or not, but I'm assuming it doesn't. So Ministry of Defence, 15 billion, and you can see the figures. They don't add up to 230 billion, but it's still an awful lot of money. And there are quite a lot of other organisations that spend money. In fact, there are something like 2,000 procurement organisations in the UK public sector, some of them very, very tiny, and certainly the biggest procurement organisations are responsible for the vast amount of procurement spend. But nevertheless, it is actually quite disaggregated. Some features of public sector procurement, that wasn't intended. 70% is actually non-central government, possibly even 75% is not central government. And people think of public sector procurement spend as being central government, including the Ministry of Defence. It isn't. The bulk is spent by local government, education, the NHS, and various non-departmental public bodies. I said 3,000 procurement organisations. I said 2,000 a minute ago. No one actually really knows, but that's a good enough figure. And this gives you some idea as to where quite a lot of the money is spent. I haven't included things like Ministry of Defence, but there's obviously a lot of money spent on defence and various things. But it gives one some idea as to where the money is spent. Again, these are just estimates because no one really knows. There's been no procurement spend analysis done for the whole public sector. It's been done fragmentarily. And procurement is pretty disorganised. We've got lots of purchasing consortia. These are just some of those in local government. Some of the consortia, some of the collaborations. They're tending to be fighting each other for business. We have a group called the Pro5, consisting of 5 purchasing organisations. In theory, they're not supposed to be competing with each other because they now come under one umbrella. In practice, they are. And that's just for England. There's Wales as well, I guess. Improvement and Efficiency South East has suddenly created its own procurement organisation. It's going to be, I guess, competing with Kent County Council, which is at the bottom. Procurement and Efficiency South East is based in Surrey. And there's a whole... Dukefield is actually a private sector procurement organisation that lets purchasing agreements and contracts for the public sector. So there's a whole range of procurement organisations and collaborations. And in local government, I reckon there's at least 30, but it could be 50. But these are some of the main ones. One or two really good ones that I've missed out, actually, that I've become aware of, particularly recently. One for construction called Scape is an absolutely excellent one and is growing. So there's some good work being done in those collaborations, but they're tending to compete with each other. Causes problems for suppliers because suppliers actually don't know how to address those organisations. We've got a great example at the moment of there's been recently a framework agreement led by the Government Procurement Service, and that lets purchasing contracts and framework agreements on behalf of central government for common items. That's available to the wider public sector, but at least there's at least 2 procurement, more than 2 actually, procurement collaborations that are trying to let framework agreements to compete with that. Be interesting to see what happens. Another purchasing groups, we've got various ones in higher education, further education, the NHS, and in other parts of the public sector. I call SPS, I've forgotten what it stands for, hang on. That's Supply Chain, SPS and HTE, Health Trust Europe, are all private sector organisations or else partly owned by the public sector and the private sector who provide procurement services to the National Health Service. And it's quite an interesting mixture there. I think there's going to be quite a dogfight between some of these organisations. So we've got quite a confused picture. And I would argue, therefore, that public sector organisations create a lot of unnecessary cost for themselves and for suppliers, in discipline, certainly. If you're a supplier and you're trying to deal with the public sector, it is very difficult to deal with it. I suppose I'm in a position now of being a supplier to the public sector, except that I don't, because I refuse to tender. I'm just not going to do that. If someone wants to offer me a contract without tendering, that's great, but I will not go through a tendering process myself. It's too much time, too much hassle. Different procedures, contracts, terms and conditions. Most suppliers don't have the time to go through different contract terms and conditions, and even if they understand them. And I certainly think that some of those issued by some public sector organisations, the public sector organisation doesn't understand the terms and conditions either. So you've got a great situation where you've got the procurement people and the suppliers sometimes not actually understanding the contract terms and conditions. Tender procedures can be overly complex. They don't have to be, but people often play safe. And I've illustrated the multiplicity of tenders for the same sort of products and multiplicity of duplicate contracts and varied specifications. Greater Manchester, when I was director of the North West Centre of Excellence, there are 10 councils in Greater Manchester. As far as I can identify at that time, just a few years ago, there were over 150 specifications for tarmac. There can only be about 5. Some of these specifications would have been created when councils were created. And they've just gone on and on and on. The product would probably have changed, so people weren't getting what they specified. But you can see the lack of innovation in all of that. And they wouldn't collaborate, the councils, either. Everyone would want their own specifications that they'd already got, without actually saying, well, hang on, are we actually getting what we're specifying now? Does this make sense? So there was a huge fight amongst people, and we did let a framework agreement, covered all the tarmac requirements, but people still stuck to their own specifications and were prepared to pay 10% more in order to do so. So very varied capability as well. I'll be controversial here, and I believe that one of the reasons why building for schools for the future failed was because of the varied capability of construction teams in local government. There were 1 or 2 that were very, very good in the Northwest. There were some that were very poor, certainly not capable of handling building schools for the future. And projects got delayed, and in 1 or 2 instances they didn't get the schools built before a new government came in. And that was down to local councils wanting to not wanting to work with others, not wanting to use the capability of others, just sticking to their own people who didn't have that capability. So there's quite serious implications sometimes for the lack of capability that you get. Inconsistency of expertise, well, I think I've given enough examples of those. And you can't use industry best practice either very often. An industry best practice might include, if you like, proper supply chain management, taking costs out of the supply chain, and I'll give an example in a minute. So public sector organisations create unnecessary costs, yes, through specifications, over complex specifications. We got some examples recently with with shared services. And the National Audit Office produced a report recently on shared services, joint back office services. And it was the IT systems that they looked at and found that, in fact, the cost of these IT systems, in some instances, far exceeded the potential savings. And people went for something that was far, far, far too complex. They didn't need it. And that was the reason. And suppliers persuaded them that they needed things that were far too complex. But at the end of the day, everyone loses. Suppliers lose because their reputation is tarnished. The public sector loses. We as taxpayers lose. So there's all sorts of issues with that. Street lighting, I came across an example in the Northwest local authorities of one authority that was actually able to reduce street lighting costs or replacement of street lamps by 40% and reduce the time from 2 weeks to 20 minutes for reasons I won't go into. I mentioned it to another local authority. Oh no, it won't work here. Wrong type of rock. Seriously, that was the argument. Wrong type of rock. And that was a local authority that I won't mention his name, but he'd had to sell a Lowry painting because he hadn't got them in order to make some money. You get that sort of attitude. And again, so you get one local authority innovating and others refuse to follow suit. And those are real problems for suppliers and anyone with innovative solutions. Very difficult to get them into the public sector. How else to take out costs? Tackle the supply chain. This is an example from someone who used to work for me, quite a brilliant person, and he was a specialist. I built up a very large contracting organisation, was able to have real specialists. And this guy was a specialist in metals. He also knew quite a lot about wood and quite a lot about office furniture. In this particular instance, this is just a simple example. He came up to me one day and said, Colin, what I'd like to do is to persuade our 3 suppliers, because we needed 3 suppliers for metal storage furniture. It was when I was head of contracts of the Benefits Agency. We spent a lot. said I'd like to get one of them to buy the steel on behalf of the others. And I said, that makes sense, but tell me more. And he said, well, because of the way prices are structured in the steel industry, they'll be able to get a price reduction of 20%. So I said, fine, tell them to do so. So we did, and they didn't. So we took the price reduction anyway, and 3 months later they did. But he also worked with suppliers to create a very much cheaper form of office desking. And he reduced costs by over 30%. And although it was an evolved environment, people had the choice whether or not to take them. After 3 months of trying them out, when we thought perhaps we'd screwed up, suddenly demand shot up. And the 3 suppliers we'd let the contracts to, I actually had to instruct them only to supply us and to ignore the contracts with other government departments. Quite an interesting little negotiation, and one I had to tell to build a new factory. This guy had worked with them, taking out costs. This was over 20 years ago. He introduced sustainability, got rid of tropical hardwoods, and he produced a design that people liked and really worked. And that's the sort of specialist expertise that I was able to employ. And I would suggest that smaller organisations cannot. And if Tesco devolves its procurement to stores, it will find it's lost its specialist expertise. So, just how can one save money through procurement? I think that these are all fairly obvious. So I'll dry up for 15 seconds while you just cast your eyes over that. And fundamentally, if we're going to actually start to really make some big savings and actually be able to introduce government policies or company policies, we've actually got to have the right procurement structure underpinned by the right information and common information IT systems and discipline within the organisation and specialist expertise available to all. And that includes market expertise, product expertise and procurement expertise. And in very many instances now that market expertise has got to be global, because we're so dependent now on whether it's our goods or services on actually global suppliers and global supply chains. So much comes from India now in terms of services without us realising it, certainly from the Far East, but also still from the States and obviously Europe. So understanding UK supply chains is not enough. So the cost of poor practice and missed opportunity, these are some examples just from my career. It doesn't mean to say we can save them now, but this is what people saved for me in some instances. And one person really did save 90% in one instance on just a few items that were bought, some laboratory consumables, because he came across a research laboratory that had the best deal in the world. The supplier had told him they got the best deal in the world. Please don't tell anyone else about it. And he was a real expert in that field. And he realised that they were being ripped off. And he had the authority and the power to go to that supplier and say, and this is against European procurement rules, if you don't reduce the prices by 90%, you won't get any further business with us. So the supplier reduced the prices by 90%. So anyone here from UK public sector can't be done, but it can. And I could go on, and some of those are actually underestimates now. That's what people say for me, but sometimes some people have actually saved a lot more than that on some of those areas. So what I want to do is just say, well, should one structure procurement? One needs, first of all, and this is something I've tried before and it's worked, in going into a group of organisations and saying, how do we actually need to structure procurement? Now, first of all, one needs to be quite clear about one's objectives. And I've suggested a list of objectives here, but the important thing is to agree those at the outset, because if you haven't got those sorted out, then you're not even at the baseline. So one needs to understand the objectives. One also needs to understand the purchase spend. So one does a purchase spend analysis. And armed with understanding the objectives, understanding the procurement spend, one can then start to make a first pass at how one structures procurement. And this is an approach I've used, and I've found it very, very useful in selling new approaches, because what I do is I get people to work it out themselves. And in this particular instance, how should one structure procurement? One puts the objectives on the left-hand side. One has various organisational options across the top, and I've just suggested some collaboration. Independence, is perfectly legitimate. Centre-led action network, a central group defining policies, procedures, processes, and sometimes deciding who should have the lead role. A joint regional approach, one could have procurement organised regionally. A sector approach, so there might need to be an approach for higher education, an approach for further education, NHS, defence, and so on. And also bringing it together nationally. And what I asked people to do, and I first started doing this 20 years ago in theory at the Civil Service College, and then started applying it myself, is then say, just do a quick pass, we've got the objectives agreed, score on a basis of 0 to 5 how far you think each organisation will be able to deliver each objective. And I can tell you that in most instances, whether it's public or private sector, we end up with the 3 right-hand ones, and usually a national approach. It doesn't have to be totally monolithic, but a national approach tends to score higher than the others. Number of points, though, there is no perfect solution. What you'll find is that no one organisational structure always comes out on top against each objective. And that's one of the points about organising procurement. You go for a best fit. But I'm going to predict and say, well, this is what I think that UK public sector procurement will look like in 10 years' time, and possibly less. I think gradually we will move to a proper structured approach. Major national contracts and suppliers for UK public sector, I mean very, very big ones, because we let some enormous ones, will be done by central major government departments. I put buying solutions there, it's now the Government Procurement Service. There will be some industry-specific ones. Ministry of Defence will continue to let Ministry of Defence contracts, but non-specialist ones, non-specific ones, they'll be tend to be let by central government. Common categories, I think, increasingly will be let by bodies like the Government Procurement Service on behalf of the whole public sector. But again, there'll be some industry-specific ones, some in science, research, some education ones, where they will need to be let by the specific sectors. And then various other relationship management with the big suppliers that will be carried out by central government on behalf of all, I think, because actually the rest of we've had negotiations with central government suppliers and claims of savings of £1,000 million, but actually those suppliers are used by other parts of the public sector as well. And if you have central government negotiating with those suppliers, what's to say that, okay, nearly finished. What is there to say that those suppliers will not recover that money from the rest of the public sector? I would. So what we're in the situation of now is tough negotiations by central government that may be leading to higher costs for the rest of the public sector. Be interesting to see if that really is happening. So we end up with this sort of model. Then regional and large local contracts would perhaps be done by regional hubs. And there's a huge commonality between different parts of the public sector, whether it's education, local government, or the NHS. And I happen to know this. There is a huge commonality of procurements, huge commonality of suppliers. Each one has its own special features as well. Each one has its own particular procurements. But nevertheless, when you look across the board, there is a huge commonality. It doesn't, at the end of the day, universities might buy SAP or whatever, but so will local government, so will the NHS. And it's the same sort of basic systems. So there's all that commonality. But small local contracts I would expect to be led by regional purchasing hubs and still some local procurement organisations. And I think that what you end up there with is a logical structure. You wouldn't be perfect, but I suspect that that is where we're heading. And if you think about it, that probably makes a lot of sense for major private sector organisations as well, even for global organisations. So public sector procurement in the future, I think, will move from where it was, independence, a lot of independence with very little collaboration. It's now moving to a stage where there's a lot of working together, a lot of collaboration, but I believe it will move to a much more integrated approach. And over the next 10 years, we will see a very different design than we have at the moment. Just one or two comments, really, though, about innovation. And one of the problems we have is that the government announces procurement policies, and by and large, it doesn't have the structures to implement them. Very often, it struggles even in central government, and it certainly doesn't have the ability to measure whether those policies are being delivered. We've had an announcement recently of a doubling in spend in the last year by central government with small to medium enterprises. You've only got to look at the figures and you realise that that simply is not possible because they haven't let enough contracts. They have big contracts lasting for several years. So that's simply not possible. And then when you scratch the figures further, you find that probably much of that comes from the Ministry of Defence, and they certainly can't account for that either. So we've got government figures, government policies that can't be implemented, whether it's on using small to medium enterprises, whether it's on innovation, whether it's on sustainability. They can't be implemented across the board. So the government then changes the policies to aspirations, which is what they did with small to medium enterprises. They had a manifesto commitment. That's become an aspiration. Anyone who knows what an aspiration in Whitehall means is we've got a commitment, we can't implement it, so we just change the word into an aspiration. Sir Humphrey from Yes Minister was very good at that, and that still continues.